Hi, my name's Stuart Lynch. I'm fortunate enough to have been selected as one of the speakers at the inaugural Swift Rockies conference held in July 2026 in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I decided to record one of my rehearsals for the talk. Now, this may not be exactly what I said at the conference, but it's pretty close, so I hope you enjoy it. Well, I have a disclaimer to make if you want to go for an early coffee. This is mostly not a tech talk, but rather a more philosophical one. So if you're staying, do an old man a favor, sit up and at least fake interest. So first, who am I? Well, my name is Stuart Lynch and I'm an independent software developer and a YouTuber. I've got 75 years of patches, upgrades, bug fixes, deprecated habits with surprisingly few fatal errors. However, according to Statistics Canada, within the next 10 years, I could face a non-recoverable one. But still, in the meantime, I'm still compiling, still shipping, and I'm still learning. I've got a degree in mathematics from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. I taught high school for 11 years. I was a helping teacher for 2 years, teaching teachers how to implement technology within their daily practice and in the classroom, and gained 3 years of valuable administrative experience in Hell as a vice principal at a secondary school, and then became an IT director in 2 different school districts for 16 years. And I was the first one in both of those school districts. And we built a relationship with Apple, and I was awarded at that time an Apple Distinguished Educator. I then retired in 2007 and went and spent 7 years as a senior services engineer with a company out of Richmond Hill, Toronto, OpenText. But let me get back to my topic, which is that there is no such thing as a self-taught developer. Self-taught developers simply do not exist. Now, I know that I've had experience with people objecting to my saying that they are not self-taught. And I understand the myth's appealing. There's the independence, the grit, the solo mastery. But really, when you think about it, you rely on others to get where you are. No one learns in isolation, and every developer stands on the work and the ideas and the generosity of others. So back to my premise again. At no time along my 57 years of learning to become a developer would I have considered myself self-taught. Rather than that term, I prefer to say that we are self-directed learners. I'm the one in control of from whom and how I learn, whether that be from blogs, books, videos, podcasts, etc. So I thought that it would be fun to take a look at how I learned to code and see if you agree with me that I'm not self-taught, but rather self-directed, learning on the backs of others. So for those of you who have been around for a while, I hope that this will be a fun trip down memory lane. And for those of you who are relatively new to this, I hope that this will give you some insight into how we had to walk uphill to and from school in the snow both ways, and how good you have it now to direct your own learning. Back in 1969, when I started university, there was no computer science. The math department offered courses in computer programming, so I thought it might be interesting if I took a couple of those courses. And programming used to be a physical process. Code was something that you could hold in your hands. You could stack on the desk, or God forbid, you could drop on the floor. We'd use punch card machines to punch out cards, and we'd submit the stack for processing and wait for the results. And depending on where you were in the hierarchy of the department, this could take hours. Teletype machines were a huge leap forward because they introduced interactive computing. Although by today's standards, they are painfully slow. So instead of submitting your entire stack of punch cards and waiting for hours for results, you could type a command and receive an immediate response. The computer would execute the command and print the results back on the paper. Even here, though, learning was not a solo act. Whether it was punch cards, teletypes, or shared terminals, we were always learning through systems and people that made access possible through manuals or courses taught by those who read the manuals. The largest amount of learning came through discussions around the teletype machine or card punch machines with my fellow students, and we were learning languages like Fortran, PL1, COBOL, and Lisp. And as a side note, if you know COBOL, you can likely have a job for life, because as I understand it, a large majority of the federal government legacy systems are written in COBOL, and they can't find enough COBOL programmers. So I graduated in 1975 and things started to change. The basic programming language was actually developed in 1964 by a couple of guys at Dartmouth University. But it became popular in 1975 when Bill Gates and Paul Allen were contracted to develop BASIC for the Altair 8800. And this became the first product of what would later become Microsoft. The Altair 8800 is widely regarded as the first commercially successful personal computer. You power on the Altair, you use the front panel switches to enter a small bootstrap loader, and then you run the bootstrap, and then the bootstrap will read the Altair BASIC from paper tape or cassette into RAM, and then BASIC starts up. But then you still have to connect a keyboard terminal, and that was often a teletype machine, and begin writing BASIC programs. It wasn't until the early 1980s, though, that personal computers really started to take off. Radio Shack put out their TRS-80, and Commodore came out with the Commodore PET. These really didn't make much into the homes. They were more in schools and corporations, but they came out then with the VIC-20 and then the Commodore 64. And of course, we've got the Apple II. And the school district where I worked had all of these computers, but I managed to get my hands on an Apple II for my math class, and I started to create some basic programs for teaching polynomial graphing techniques, and I also created some flashcard type programs for learning assistance centers. With computers arriving in the home, this led to the proliferation of computer magazines. And one of the first were Byte Computer, and that was followed by another one called Creative Computing. So how did we learn to code from BASIC? Well, we had the manuals that came with the Apple II, but there was no formal training, no YouTube videos. However, those same magazines offered basic programs in print that you could carefully type in and modify to get what you wanted. And during that time, we also saw the rise in a number of meetups or the creation of user groups. In the US, there was the famous Homebrew Computer Club, Apple Core, and the Boston Computer Society. But they were a long way from Calgary or Vancouver, so we were in a bit of a disadvantage. And then in the late 80s, a wonderful thing happened. Though modems were invented in the 1950s, it wasn't until the arrival of the personal computer in the 80s that computer hobbyists like myself started to use them. We started with a 300 baud, swiftly changed to 1200 baud, then 2400 and 9600 baud modems. But what did we use to connect them to? There was still no real internet access. Instead, there were paid services like CompuServe and America Online, where we could connect and participate in forums, including those discussing computer programming. But it was also the golden age of the bulletin board system, the BBS. And now we could connect to bulletin board services across the United States, like the Berkeley Mac Users Group or the Arizona Mac Users Group. And in Canada, we had Magic. And Magic was run on a system called First Class. And I have a particular connection to First Class because when I was in my 2 school districts, I ran First Class systems where I hung initially 12 to 20 modems off of a Mac 2 so that I would allow staff to communicate with each in the district, whether they were from home or from the school. And every school had an underused fax machine. So I hung a modem off that line and found software that allowed me to use the Apple Talk network to connect to it from multiple locations so long as it was not in use. Thankfully, that all started to change with the development or the implementation of the internet. Now we are no longer limited to 20 simultaneous connections. First Class and other BBS systems could put their servers on the internet and could host hundreds of users at a time over the internet. There was now mailing lists that you could subscribe where people could post and share code. The Usenet became a thing. You'd connect to your local Usenet server through a newsreader application. You'd post a message to a news group. The server forwarded that message to neighboring servers, and within minutes or hours, the messages had propagated to servers all over the world. The only limitation was bandwidth. And then, of course, there was the World Wide Web. Everyone started creating personal homepages and sharing coding tips and tricks. And RSS feeds became a thing. There was an increase in the number of forums beyond private BBS systems. The world was opening up, and we were all learning together from each other. In 2005, we saw the introduction of YouTube and the first coding channels. In 2008, Stack Overflow was founded, and it quickly became my go-to resource. By this time, I'd left education and was working for OpenText, which had acquired First Class, and I was responsible for training and developing tools that customers could use to enhance the product and use the product's API effectively. I had to learn JavaScript quickly, so Stack Overflow became my primary resource. And at the same time that Stack Overflow was founded, GitHub was also founded. And by the 2010s, it became the dominant platform for open source collaboration. So even more code to sift through. 2008 was also a big year because that also saw the introduction of the iOS SDK. However, that was beyond my comprehension and pay grade because it was yet to see. Then in 2014, things started to change again. I was made redundant and too old to find a real job. So I decided to shift to mobile development, and thank God for Swift. The number of YouTubers exploded, and this turned out to be my favorite way to learn. We had people like Brian Bong in Let's Build That App, Sean Allen, Jared Davidson, the young teenager who had a very large YouTube channel. I was so envious of him. Chris Ching from Canada, Code with Chris, Kilo Loco, Paul Hudson. And that's continued on till today with Muhammad Azam, Flow Writes Code, Rebelliver, Karen Prater, DevTechie, and many, many more. So many I can't mention them all. And there are a huge number of developers who painstakingly recorded their thoughts in blogs. Ray Wenderlich went on with Codeco, Brent Simmons, Craig Hockenberry, and Matt Thompson. And many more like Donnie Walls and Anton Vanderlee, Natalia Panfarova. Notice that every single person on this list shared because they personally needed the knowledge to exist in some form. They shared because that's what the community does. And every iOS developer who followed them learned from what they recorded and what they wrote. Not in isolation. We are standing on their shoulders. Other forms of learning also existed. In 2010, Udemy was founded. And in 2014, I enrolled in my first course offered by Rob Percival, who guaranteed that I would learn everything I needed to know to become a professional Swift developer. Right. Other services also popped up offering different courses. But for me, though, the one that really stood out and still does today is the Stanford CS 193. It's the only comprehensive course that I've found that really teaches you best practices. And finally, there are books. I purchase a lot of them, and I still do. These are just some of the books from my Gumroad collection. And you may notice some here from popular authors like Paul Hudson, Donnie Walls, Natalia Panfarova, and of course, Daniel Steinberg. And by 2019, things had really changed again. I think I had 8 to 10 apps on the App Store, and all of them scratching an itch, and I learned a lot in the process. They were all UIKit. Then everything changed. SwiftUI was released, and I pretty much gave up on UIKit forever. I also thought that it was time to start giving back, and that's when I started my YouTube channel. It's all SwiftUI, with only the first 1 or 2 videos covering any UIKit at all. In fact, there are so many resources now that it led to a major problem for people learning code. You had this illusion of understanding, the happy path trap where all code works as expected. And you find resources that look like it's exactly what you want, only to find that the code is now deprecated. These resources are often frozen in time. And you also run into what is known as the cargo cult problem. And this comes from a real historical phenomenon that occurred after World War II in parts of the South Pacific. During the war, isolated island communities saw military forces arrive with airplanes full of cargo, food, medicine, radio, tools, clothing, and other astonishing supplies. The military built runways, used radios, wore headphones, waved signal flags, and performed all sorts of strange rituals that appeared to summon airplanes from the sky. Well, after the war ended, the military left, and some islanders tried to bring the cargo back by imitating the visible behavior. They built mock runways out of dirt, wooden control towers, fake radios made from coconuts, and marched with carved wooden rifles hoping the airplanes would arrive. They copied the form, without understanding the systems. If you never break out of this trap, you'll be missing the right mental model, and you fall into a dependency loop. You mistake imitation for understanding. It was a wonderful time for learning, but it was also a real mess. And my method of learning was to ask a question and find some code to paste into my projects, tweak it, and hope that it worked. I never really understood half of what was going on. And this is the kind of thing that my code often looked like under the hood. It may occasionally get off track, but eventually it would work. So I guess that was good enough. And now there's this elephant in the room. In 2022, things changed again. ChatGPT was released. It was a bit of a novelty at the time. Google Bard changed to Gemini, and it was launched in 2023. And in 2024, Anthropic and Claude 3 was released. These are really starting to heat up. Still, the models weren't good enough yet for coding, but the reliance on Stack Overflow rapidly declined once ChatGPT launched. Developers just had to ask the large language model, probably not realizing that they were likely trained on Stack Overflow anyway. But in 2025, Agentic Coding became mainstream. And although prototypes existed in 2023-24, many developers point to 2025 as the year Agentic Coding became practical. Of course, a new metric has been added to our project evaluation, where we started out by using the lines of code or agile story points. We graduated to the number of pull requests. We now measure a project by the number of tokens spent. And the question for a lot of us is AI a tool or a crutch? What I fear is that we're going to lose critical thinking skills. I've always been a fan of Rube Goldberg machines, and I think this video exemplifies what it means to use agentic coding and how you have to be the director to make it work. It's a bit of a lengthy video, so I'll speed it up a bit, but I think you really find it quite amusing. With agentic coding, you're always stopping, correcting, giving it more direction. Anyway, you get the idea. So to emphasize my point, we're not self-taught developers. We are directors, and the best directors know their craft. What you know expires fast, and what lasts is how quickly we can learn what's next. For me, the primary source of my learning is the community. Finally, Apple II is recognizing the efforts of the developer community, and back in May, displayed the names and profiles of 50 developer community builders on its website. These are people who go above and beyond, not just creating YouTube videos or writing blog posts or publishing books, but also organizing meetups, conferences, hackathons, etc. In fact, 3 of them are here at Swift Rockies and are presenting. They're Daniela Verzan, Adrian Eves, and Michaela Karen. Sharing what you know and what you've learned is part of learning. There's no way that I'd be as knowledgeable as I am today without my YouTube channel. Having to clearly articulate what I've learned is part of the learning process, and this is how I make things stick. Others write blogs or mentor others. This is the way you learn and how often others can learn from you. So before I conclude, let me just share a few little things that I've learned recently by following different people on different social media platforms. My apologies for not giving credit to those that shared these tips. They definitely are not mine. So the first one is this clear text field. I really don't like that text field in SwiftUI doesn't have the ability to add a button by default instead of me having to always hit backspace to clear a text field. So the way that I would approach this in the past was I would create myself a modifier that would just overlay a button using an xmark.circle.fill that would clear the text, and it was bound to some isFocus property. And then I'd create a view modifier. So then I can return back to my view and simply apply that view modifier to each one of my text fields. And now when I enter that text field, it gets the focus, the button appears. And then if I tap the button, it will clear the text field. Well, what I didn't realize was that there is a simpler way to do this. You can simply use a UI text field appearance embedded inside a task modifier with a clear button set to while editing. Now when I enter the text field, that button appears and it serves the same purpose as my modifier did. Another thing that bothers me is pickers. I don't like how the label and the control are separated and take over the entire width of the view. What I'd really like to be able to do is to specify that I want the picker to be aligned to either the trailing, the center, or the leading edge, and have the label abutted right up against the control. So what one could do is one could hide the labels and then embed them in HStacks and add a text view that is the label. That's kind of redundant. And then I guess you could add a spacer to push that view to whichever edge you want, or leave the spacer out and have it aligned to the center. A better solution than using spacers would be to actually set the frame to be a max width of infinity and assign the alignment to be either the trailing or the leading edge. But that's still a lot of code. A better solution would be to remove the HStacks altogether. I'm going to keep the frames here, but now I'm back to square one. And all I have to do now, though, is apply a fixed size, and it will assign and compact my labels and my controls the way I want. Of course, I can always create a view modifier for this as well, and it reduces these lines of code to simply a single line of code. This was new to me. I had no idea it existed. But before I get to that, one of the things that bothers me about text editors is that you can get into a text editor view here, but there is no easy way to dismiss the keyboard. So what we've learned is that we can create a focus state property and then apply the focus to that binding of the isFocused to the text editor itself, and then create a button that will be placed on the keyboard that will simply set that Boolean isFocused property to false, so that when I tap on it, it's going to dismiss the keyboard, like this. Now, this is nothing new. I'm sure most of you are aware of that. But what I learned was that there is another thing that I could do. I could create another Boolean property called showFindNavigator, set it again to false, and then add another modifier called FindNavigator that is bound to that showFindNavigator. I'd never heard of FindNavigator. And then create another toolbar button with a magnifying glass that's just simply going to toggle that showFindNavigator property. So now when I enter the text field, I get two buttons. One of them is this magnifying glass where I can come in and I can start to type things that I want to find within the text editor. And in fact, it's found 4 instances here, and I can simply just toggle and go between them all. I never knew that that existed. And here's another thing. If I have 2 state properties, Boolean state properties, and I want to run a function when both of them have changed, like this action here, let's perform this action. So if foo and bar are true, it's going to run the action. Otherwise, it's just going to leave the action as an empty string. What I would normally do is I would create an onChange modifier and look for changes on both foo and bar and perform the action in the body of the onChange method. Well, because foo and bar are both Booleans, which are equatable, I could enclose those in an array and watch for both of them. And now they'll both work because changing one creates a new array. Sometimes I'd like to know what the RGB or the hex value for that matter is of a color view. The trouble is that that value is going to change whether I'm in light or dark mode. So how would I go about finding that particular color and replacing that text view with the actual hex color? Well, this requires an environment. Again, because light and dark mode display different color generations depending on whether or not you're in light or dark. So what you can then do is you can create an extension to color and pass in the environment values as into the function itself. And then you can use the resolve function in the environment to flatten and get access to the RGB red, green, blue, and opacities values for that RGB color or for that color view. And then all you have to do is specify that you want to have the description and return that description. And then now what you're going to see, instead of this text being a hex with a bunch of question marks, if I replace it with the selected color, calling that function, it's going to allow me to see what the hex value of that view is. So it's going to be different in light as opposed to dark. Now there are a couple of edge cases, however. If you use white or black, it doesn't work. You have to actually override that. But regardless now, when I'm picking any color that I want using a color picker here, whether I'm in light or dark mode, I'm going to be able to get the RGB and the hex value directly using that resolve. And white and black work as well. Now I'm a big fan of Mastodon. That's where I get my feeds from. I'm also a big fan of Matt Massacott. I don't ever want to miss anything that he writes. I use NetNewsWire as my newsreader, so I'd love to have his Mastodon feed come in as a news feed. Well, you can do that. You can simply go to his URL for his account and change and add the .rss to the end of the URL. And now it's a news feed that you can subscribe to in your newsreader. So now I get all of Matt's feeds directly. And the final one here is this one. I always have long names for a lot of my files, and I really want to know what does that name look like in the Finder. And I'm always having to stretch and resize these windows through manual, or these panes through manual resizing. Well, I didn't know that if I just hover over top of the column and I can click, and I can actually choose to right size that one particular column. Or if I want to, I can also right click one more time and choose to resize them all either individually or equally. But let's go individually, and they'll all get to the right size. So I hope that through this talk, you'll understand that I'm really not putting people down by saying that you're not self-taught. In fact, it's just semantics. You're a self-directed learner, and it's only through the sharing of what you know that the rest of us can learn. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel. And also, please check out my website. You'll be able to search my full collection of YouTube videos and watch them in line. You'll also find all of my apps, not only those on the App Store, but also the free ones available on Gumroad and GitHub. And finally, you'll discover my blog posts, also fully searchable by title or keyword.